This video is going to show you exactly how to carry yourself with the kind of quiet authority that makes people respect you before you say a word and keep respecting you long after you've left the room. Not through performance, not through aggression, through 4 specific disciplines that most men and women are completely backward on. And here's the thing nobody tells you: the most obvious way people try to project power, being louder, spending more, reacting faster, is the exact behavior that guarantees they'll never have it. I'll explain why that backfires, and I'll show you what actually works. If that landed, type the word king in the comments right now. Let's begin. Here's what your average day probably looks like. You wake up, and before your feet hit the floor, you're already scrolling. Someone said something on a group chat. A news alert is pulling at your attention. Your boss sent an email at 11 p.m. and somehow you feel like you should have already responded. By the time you're in the shower, you're rehearsing arguments you haven't had yet. By the time you're at the table for breakfast, you're already performing, laughing at things you don't find funny, agreeing with things you don't believe, swallowing what you actually wanted to say because the moment passed or because you couldn't find the clean version of it, and by the end of the day you feel drained, not because you worked hard, but because you spent the entire day reacting to everyone else's pace, everyone else's agenda, everyone else's idea of who you should be. The cost of this isn't just exhaustion, it's the slow erosion of your self-respect. And here's what makes it insidious: it's not dramatic. No single moment destroyed your sense of authority. It was the 1,000 small surrenders, the text you sent too fast, the opinion you walked back because someone pushed, the money you spent to feel like a version of yourself you haven't actually built yet. Each one felt harmless. Together they formed a pattern, and patterns, repeated long enough, become identity. Marcus Aurelius understood this better than almost anyone who has ever lived. He was emperor of Rome, the most powerful position in the ancient world, and he wrote to himself privately in a journal he never intended to publish that the first and only conquest that matters is the conquest of your own character. Not the conquest of territory, not the conquest of other people's opinions, the inner one. He believed that a man who cannot govern himself cannot truly lead anything, including his own life. The external markers of status, the title, the income, the audience, are built on sand if the interior architecture isn't solid. That idea is the foundation of everything we're going to cover today. So here's the central insight, stated plainly. Carrying yourself like a king is not about status. It's about sovereignty. It means your inner state is not controlled by your outer circumstances. It means your words are chosen, not vented. It means your movements and decisions are deliberate, not desperate. And it means your relationship with money reflects your values, not your wounds. This is not about being cold. It's not about being distant or superior or above emotion. Those are the shallow imitations of what we're actually describing, and they're everywhere. The guy at the bar who says as little as possible because he thinks silence makes him mysterious. The woman who spends aggressively to signal arrival at a place she hasn't actually reached yet. The person in a meeting who performs confidence by dominating the room and then wonders why nobody trusts them. That's not sovereignty. That's performance anxiety dressed in expensive clothes. What we're building here is something quieter and more durable than that. Let's break it down. The first discipline is controlling your mind specifically, controlling what you allow to occupy it. Picture a Sunday afternoon. You're sitting at home with nothing immediately pressing, and instead of feeling rested, you feel vaguely anxious. You pick up your phone, you put it down, you pick it up again. You're scrolling through other people's lives, and without quite noticing it, you've started mentally comparing yourself to their careers, their bodies, their apparent ease. By the time you set the phone down, the afternoon hasn't refreshed you, it's drained you, and you haven't done anything. Epictetus, who was born a slave and became one of the most respected philosophers in the ancient world, said that people are disturbed not by events, but by the opinions they hold about events. In modern language, your suffering is almost never coming from reality. It's coming from the story you're running on top of reality. And the stories that do the most damage are the ones you absorb passively through comparison, through passive consumption, through the background noise of a world that benefits financially from your anxiety. There's a well-documented psychological pattern called the spotlight effect, the tendency to overestimate how much other people are noticing and judging you. Research by Thomas Gilovich and colleagues at Cornell showed that people consistently think they're the center of others' attention, when in reality most people are almost entirely focused on their own spotlight effect. This means most of the mental performance you're running, the rehearsed explanations, the image management, the self-consciousness is playing to an audience that isn't watching. The mental energy you spend on it is real, the audience isn't. The reframe is this: protecting your mind isn't selfishness, it's maintenance. You cannot draw from a contaminated well, and a mind that is constantly reacting, constantly comparing, constantly bracing for judgment is not available for the clarity and deliberateness that real authority requires. The action is simple, though not easy. Designate your first 30 minutes after waking as a no-input zone. No phone, no news, no social media, no other people's thoughts flooding in before you've had a chance to orient yourself. Use that time to sit with your own thinking, what you actually value, what you actually intend for the day. You'll feel resistance at first because the habit of reaching for input is strong. Do it anyway. The mind you recover in those 30 minutes will be clearer, calmer, and significantly more your own than the mind that starts the day in someone else's feet. The second discipline is controlling your mouth, and this is where most people sabotage themselves without realizing it. You are in a meeting. Someone says something you disagree with, something that's actually wrong, something that reflects a misunderstanding of the situation, and the old version of you would have jumped in immediately, forcefully, maybe even with a slight edge in your voice. Or you would have vented about it afterward to a colleague. Either way, the reaction was fast, and in the moment it felt justified. Here's what Seneca observed: most speech is not communication. Most speech is release. People talk to discharge pressure, not to transmit meaning. And the person who can't hold a thought long enough to examine it before speaking is advertising loudly that they are not in command of themselves. Seneca wrote to a friend that you should never let your tongue run ahead of your thoughts, that every word spoken carelessly is a piece of your authority, given away for free. The psychological framing here is important. There's a concept called cognitive fluency, the idea that things which are easy to process feel more credible and more trustworthy. When someone speaks slowly and deliberately, choosing their words with apparent care, people perceive what they're saying as more considered, more reliable. When someone speaks at the speed of their anxiety, interrupting themselves, over-explaining, filling silence with noise, the listener's trust drops even if the content is technically correct. The speed of your speech is a signal whether you intend it or not. The reframe: silence is not absence, it is presence. The person who doesn't immediately fill every silence, who takes a beat before responding, who occasionally says, "Let me think about that," that person reads as thoughtful, as someone with interior resources, as someone who doesn't need the approval of the room to feel secure. That is the exact opposite of how most people interpret silence, which is as weakness or uncertainty. In reality, the person most uncomfortable with silence is the one who can't sit with themselves. Start practicing the 2-second pause. Before you respond to anything that provokes you, a sharp comment, a challenging question, a statement you want to correct, let 2 full seconds pass first. It won't feel like long to you. It will feel much longer to the other person. And in those 2 seconds, you'll often catch the reactive response before it leaves your mouth and replace it with something more precise, more authoritative, and more aligned with who you're trying to be. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. How many relationships have you strained? How many opportunities have you closed, not because of what you decided, but because of what you said before you'd finished deciding? The third discipline is controlling your moves, the way you occupy space, make decisions, and respond to pressure. Here's a scene most people recognize. You're waiting for something, a response to a proposal, a decision from someone whose opinion matters to you, an outcome you can't fully control. And instead of functioning normally, you're checking your email compulsively. You're interpreting small signals as large ones. You're in a low-level state of suspended animation, not quite present anywhere, because your attention is entirely captured by the thing you can't control. Your moves, everything you do during that waiting period, are compromised. You're not choosing. You're orbiting. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about something he called the reserve clause, the idea that you pursue your intentions and plans not with white-knuckle desperation, but with the built-in acknowledgement that outcomes are not entirely yours to determine. He described it as acting with a mental footnote. I intend to do this, and if the world allows. This is not passivity. It is the recognition that clinging to a specific outcome weakens your ability to respond well to whatever actually happens. The person who must have a particular result is already at a disadvantage before the result is known. This touches on what attachment theory describes as anxious attachment, the pattern where a deep fear of loss or rejection drives monitoring behaviors, reassurance seeking, and a collapse of the healthy functional self when an important relationship or outcome feels uncertain. The problem isn't the caring. The problem is the collapse. When your capacity to operate effectively becomes dependent on a specific answer from outside yourself, you have handed authority over your own life to whoever or whatever holds that answer, and they can feel it. People sense when you need them to tell you who you are. The reframe. Your moves should express your character, not audition for approval. Every decision you make should be traceable to what you value, not to what you fear losing. When your moves come from values, you project coherence. When they come from fear, even a beautifully executed move communicates the fear underneath it. The practice here is what you might call a decision audit. For 1 week, before any significant decision or action, ask yourself a single question. Am I doing this because I believe it's right, or because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't? You'll be surprised how often the honest answer is the second one. You'll also be surprised how different your posture becomes when you start making fewer moves from the second category. Now we're roughly at the midpoint of this video, and if you've stayed this far, something in this is resonating with you, which means you already operate at a different level than most people who clicked on a thumbnail and left in the first 2 minutes. If this is adding value, I'd ask you to like this video right now. It costs you nothing and it helps more people who need this actually find it. And here's what's coming in the second half. We're going to cover money, which is where everything we've discussed gets tested. And then I'm going to show you the paradox at the center of all of this that most people who try to carry themselves better never see. That blind spot is exactly what keeps them performing authority instead of having it. Stay with me. The fourth discipline is controlling your money. And this is where character either becomes concrete or exposes itself as theater. You've seen the pattern. Someone gets a raise, and the raise disappears into a lifestyle upgrade within 6 months. New car, better apartment, restaurant tabs that signal arrival, the external markers change, the internal experience of security doesn't. In fact, it often gets worse, because now the performance requires a bigger stage and the cost of maintaining it has increased. The spending isn't about enjoyment, it's about identity management. It's a story being told to an audience, and the audience includes the person spending the money. Seneca had a phrase that cuts to the center of this. He wrote that poverty is not about how much you have, it's about wanting more than you have. The man who earns little and spends less, who has arranged his life around sufficiency, sleeps better than the man who earns a great deal but has oriented his entire identity around what he can display. One of them is free. The other is in a kind of servitude, working to sustain a performance, unable to step back from it because the performance has become the self. There's a well-known pattern in behavioral economics, sometimes called lifestyle inflation or hedonic adaptation, the phenomenon, where improvements in material circumstances quickly become the new baseline, providing no lasting increase in satisfaction. The first time you fly business class, it feels remarkable. The 5th time, it's just the expected experience, which means the pursuit of status through spending is genuinely incapable of delivering what it promises. Not because wealth is bad, but because the brain adapts to it so quickly that each new level of material comfort neutralizes itself in weeks or months. You keep running to stay in place, and the running is expensive. The reframe. The goal is not to have money. The goal is to not need it to feel like yourself. Those are completely different things, and the second one is available to you right now regardless of your current income. The practice is this. Look at your last 30 days of spending and ask for each significant purchase one question. Did this express who I actually am? Or did it perform a version of me I'm trying to convince other people I am? Most of us, if we are honest, will find a meaningful number in the second category. That number represents the gap between your actual character and the character you're renting. Start closing that gap, not by spending less, necessarily by spending on what actually reflects your values and removing what doesn't. What you spend on is a self-portrait. Make sure it looks like you. Now we arrive at the fifth discipline, the one that synthesizes the others, and the one that most people who want to carry themselves differently get completely backwards. Learning to want less recognition. Here is the paradox I planted at the beginning of this video, and I'm going to be direct about it now. Most people, when they decide they want to carry themselves with more authority, immediately start doing more. They speak more carefully to be noticed for their precision. They dress better to signal their elevation. They manage their reactions and then wait to see if anyone noticed. They're still running the same software with better aesthetics, and it doesn't work because authority built on the need to be perceived as authoritative is still a need, still a dependency, still something other people can take from you by simply not giving you the response you wanted. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in his private journal that is genuinely startling when you let it land. He reminded himself that the people who praised him, whose opinions he might value, would be dead within a generation, and so would the people they praised all the way back through history. He wasn't being nihilistic. He was doing something specific. He was trying to detach the quality of his work and his character from its reception so that the work could be done purely, without the corruption of audience dependence. He was the most powerful man in the Western world, writing to himself that approval is a trap, even the approval of intelligent people whose opinions you respect. The psychological concept that maps onto this is what some researchers describe as external versus internal locus of control, the difference between a person who believes their sense of self-worth is determined by their circumstances, results, and other people's responses, versus the person who has developed an internal center of gravity that doesn't rise and fall with external feedback. People with a strong internal locus of control are measurably more resilient, more consistent in their behavior, and less susceptible to manipulation, because there's no lever available on the outside that reliably destabilizes their inside. Here's the counterintuitive part, and this is what makes it the sharpest idea in this entire video. The less you need to be seen as powerful, the more powerful you actually become. Because when you stop performing, when you stop managing your image and angling for response, you become legible. People can read you clearly. They know where you stand because you stand there regardless of who's watching. And that consistency, that absence of theater, is experienced by other people as authority in its most refined form. Not dominance, reliability, the sense that this person is the same person in every room, that there's a real interior architecture behind the exterior. The irony is devastating for the people who miss it. The harder you work to be perceived as someone who doesn't need approval, the more you reveal that you need it. The man who's always explaining why he doesn't care what people think is clearly thinking about what people think constantly. The woman who announces her boundaries before anyone has crossed them is still defining herself by other people's potential responses. The person who truly doesn't need it simply behaves from their own interior and leaves the perception to take care of itself. The practice for this final discipline is the hardest one because it's not a behavior change, it's a reorientation of motivation. For the next week, whenever you do something, a decision, a conversation, a purchase, an action, before you take it, ask, would I do this exactly the same way if no one ever found out? If the answer is no, that's information. It doesn't mean you stop, it means you get honest about why you're doing it. And that honesty over time is what allows you to build a character that doesn't need an audience. Now let me show you what you actually look like when you've built this. You wake up and the phone isn't the first thing you reach for. Your first 30 minutes belong to you, to clarity, to intention, to the quiet construction of a day that reflects what you actually value. You're not bracing for the news, you're not performing before you've even left the room. You know what you want the day to be. You move toward it. You get into a conversation where someone says something wrong, something that challenges you, something that would have had the old version of you reacting instantly with heat, and you pause. 2 seconds, maybe 3. And what comes out of your mouth is precise, calm, and more devastating in its accuracy than anything the emotional reaction would have produced. The other person registers something they might not be able to name. You don't explain it to them. You move on. You look at your finances and they look like you. Not like the person you were trying to become to impress someone who probably wasn't paying attention anyway. Like the actual you, your values, your priorities, your genuine pleasures. There's less performance in the numbers. There's more resource. Because money not spent maintaining a fiction stays in your hands. You walk into a room and you don't scan it immediately for approval, for threats, for social positioning. You're not performing entry. You simply arrive. And because you arrive without agenda, without the ambient anxiety of a person who needs this room to confirm them, you have a quality of presence that most people find almost impossible to ignore. Not because you're louder or larger or more dramatic. Because you're complete. Because nothing external is required to finish the sentence of who you are. The world doesn't get quieter. People don't stop being difficult. Situations don't stop being complicated. What changes is that you stop being organized around the difficulty. You stop orienting your whole self toward what might happen, what someone might think, what the reaction might be. You move from the inside out, not the outside in. And the difference in lived experience between those two orientations is the difference between a life that feels managed and a life that feels like yours. Here is your challenge for the next 7 days. Choose one of these 4 disciplines: mind, mouth, moves, or money, and apply its core practice with complete commitment for the full week. Just one. Not all 4. 1. The phone-free morning. The 2-second pause before responding. The decision audit before every significant move. The spending self-portrait at the end of the week. Pick the one that stings the most when you think about it. That's the one. Because the king is not the person who controls everything around them. The king is the person who has stopped being controlled by it. Leave a comment right now with the word sovereign. It tells me this landed, and it tells the algorithm that this conversation matters, which helps more people find it, and subscribe so they don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching this all the way through. Stay sovereign.